A Flash in the Dark, Chapter 44, Verses. 10 minutes later, a nondescript van pulled into the parking garage at Star Labs. Felicity pulled the grating down and nodded at the driver of the van, a burly African-American dressed in mostly black with his hood pulled up. He nodded and opened his door, stepping out of the van and pulling the doors open. A man dressed in dark green hopped out of the back of the van, a quiver at his back and a bow in his hand. He stood and pulled back his hood one-handed, revealing a short crop of blonde hair and blue eyes hiding behind a green mask. Cisco was practically bouncing. The arrow turned to Felicity, who shrugged. "Don't look at me, Oliver. Dr. Wells figured us out and outed you to the rest of them," she insisted. He shook his head and pulled off his mask, turning back to the group. "We need to focus on finding Barry right now. We will talk about this later. Do we have any idea where she's heading?" One short discussion later, Oliver had mounted his bike, which had been with him in the back of the van, and taken off to search the streets. Caitlin led the way back to the Cortex, her heels clicking on the linoleum. Cisco was still bouncing. Felicity rolled her eyes as Diggle shook his head. "I knew the arrow was Oliver Queen," Cisco said, practically dancing into the Cortex. Dr. Wells raised an eyebrow, and Cisco blushed slightly. "Okay, I had it narrowed down to a list of like 100 people, but he was definitely on that list." Diggle rolled his eyes as Caitlin turned to Dr. Wells. "We need to find a way to stop Barry," she pointed out. Dr. Wells nodded. "I have an idea about that. Joe, I'll need your help," he called. Joe nodded, and the two started grabbing equipment as Felicity sat down at one of the computers. "We'll have to find her first. Anyone she would have major beef with right now?" the blonde asked, fingers already flying across the keyboard in front of her. Caitlin shrugged and began to tick off names on her fingers. "Leonard Snart is the first to come to mind, but he hasn't been seen in Central in weeks. If he's the one who shot her in the back, probably Oliver," the redhead began. "He actually did that? I thought he was kidding," Diggle said with a raised eyebrow. Felicity nodded. "He was not kidding, apparently. Anyone else?" she asked, eyes still focused on the screen in front of her. Caitlin frowned. "She and Joe have been fighting a lot," she said, frowning. Cisco nodded. "I heard her mention something about one of the other detectives petitioning for an anti-flash task force, but I didn't catch a name. The man in yellow, but honestly, we aren't even sure he's real. Iris for her blog, General Eiling. The list is actually pretty long," he pointed out. Diggle raised an eyebrow. "She makes enemies faster than Oliver does," he said, shaking his head. Felicity nodded. "But she also has more friends," she pointed out. Diggle sighed as Felicity's hands flew across the keys. She whooped in triumph a moment later. Facial recognition caught her heading out of town. Felicity pulled up the video, which caught Barry in full flash getup, screeching to a halt, the asphalt behind her smoking and bubbling with heat at her heels. Her hands were clutching her head, and she looked like she was screaming as her eyes, just barely visible, flashed back and forth between red and their usual hazel. "She's trying to fight it," Caitlin reasoned. Diggle frowned as Barry blurred out of sight once more. "How likely do we think it is that she'll be able to shake this on her own?" he asked. Caitlin shook her head. "Not very. It'll get worse. The more she fights it, the worse it gets. Given the brain scans of the victims at the bank and the SWAT officer who were affected, a normal human wouldn't be able to fight this off at all. Barry's healing factor has kept it at bay for this long, but even that has its limits, and if she keeps bottling it in, there's no telling what negative effects this could have on her brain in the long run," Caitlin said in a rush. Felicity pressed a finger to her ear. "Did you get all of that, Oliver?" she asked. Oliver nodded, the wind trying to pull back his hood. "What street was she heading out of town on?" he demanded. Felicity zoomed in on the street sign and swore. "Shit, Oliver, I think I know where she's going." "Where?" "The warehouse." Oliver swore and spun round, earning panicked honking from the cars around them as he sped off towards the warehouse. Barry didn't feel right. Everything was a mess of blurry red and black shapes. She was so angry her head throbbed. All she could think was that she needed to get away. She didn't want to hurt anyone. Except that she really, really did. She screeched to a halt and gripped her head, trying to get her head to stop throbbing. She had to get away, now, before she lost control entirely. She didn't even think about where she was going. She just had to keep going. Oliver pulled up to the back of the warehouse just in time to see a streak of lightning smash into one of the wooden beams holding up the remaining roof of the shipping dock. The roof collapsed in a large cloud of dust. A red figure pulled herself out of the rubble. He shot a rope arrow at her before she spotted him. She whirled as much as she could with her torso wrapped in rope. "You need to calm down," he shouted. The smile she shot him was downright sinister. He had never thought he'd see something like that on Barry's face. Her eyes were blazing red. "And you need to hang on." Her voice was vibrating and rumbling. Oliver's eyes went wide as he grabbed his bow with the other hand, and Barry took off at super speeds, dragging him along behind her. Sparks flew from the metal pieces of his costume as the dirt road was replaced with asphalt again. He managed to reach the release button on his bow just as he felt the leather sleeves heat up to near unbearable levels. He wound up sprawled in the middle of the road and had to tuck and roll out of the way of an approaching semi-truck. His shirt was singed at the edges. This was going to be a lot harder than he thought. Barry was no longer holding back in the slightest. Back at Star Labs, Felicity was chewing on her nails. She'd managed a quick patchwork of security feeds and CCTV that gave them an idea of what was happening in the fight. Joe and Dr. Wells had taken off in a very quickly modified Star Labs van not 3 minutes ago. "I just hope they can change Barry back before she kills Oliver," Caitlin said, beginning to pace the cortex. Diggle watched as Oliver struggled to his feet and shook his head. "I'm more worried about what Oliver might have to do to Barry," he pointed out. Caitlin looked over at him skeptically. "Barry has superpowers. Oliver has a bow and arrows." She shot back. Diggle looked up from the screen. "Do you know how many people Oliver has killed with that bow and arrow?" he asked. Cisco looked skeptical. "Recurve bow arrows can travel up to 300 feet per second, so like 200 miles an hour. Barry can run 3 times that fast," Cisco reasoned. Diggle shook his head. "Oliver's been at this a long time. My money's on experience," he said, glancing back at the screen. Cisco sat down in front of one of the screens. "Mine's on speed," Cisco said, crossing his arms. Felicity whirled on them. "Are we seriously discussing this right now? 2 of our best friends are about to duke it out, possibly to the death, because one of them has been driven into a homicidal rage by a crazy metahuman, and you guys are placing bets? You do realize that if one of them kills the other, the one who survives is never going to get over it, right? Oliver is still madly in love with her, no matter how hard he denies it, and if Barry kills him, she will never be the same person. She'll never be able to forgive herself." The cortex was silent for a moment. Cisco's mouth had fallen open. "Wait, Barry and Oliver were a thing? The Flash and the Arrow dated?" he demanded. Felicity massaged her temple as she sat back down hard in her chair. "I can't believe that's what you got from that, Cisco,"